This video will explain to you what we're looking for in the third exegetical exercise. What you see displayed is the syllabus, focusing on section C, page 9, where the exegetical exercises begin. On the lower portion of the screen, a separate page is shown, namely exercise 3. What we're looking for in this particular exercise is to hone our skill and our appreciation of the value of spending some time for a focal passage in order to unearth what sort of historical context it belongs to. We're looking for what sort of information regarding its historical setting will be vital and illuminating as we seek to understand the message of the passage. Let's look at the second column where the instructions are given. Begin by reading your focal passage. The example that will be given in column 3 will arise from the focal passage, Proverbs 11:1. But when it comes time for you to carry this out for your own assignment, go to column 4. You'll be concentrating on the book of Numbers, chapters 22, 23, and 24, the Balaam story. Let's go back to the instruction column. The sorts of things that we fit under the general heading of historical context include insights related to these categories. Customs. What were people accustomed to doing? How did they conduct their life? Some of these might be ceremonies, perhaps relating to birth, marriage, or burial. It could have to do with business transaction customs, customs related to travel or government. You can see that government is listed as a separate heading, since it's a specialized field of its own. If the passage you're dealing with talks about people in positions of power, monarchy, or other things, then we would want to understand the monarchy in that era so that we appreciate what's being implied and referred to, what the original audience would have already understood concerning the monarchy. As to worldview, we're talking about overarching assumptions concerning human existence. The overarching worldview in the ancient world was one that made room for the supernatural. We're not restricting this to Israel. Go to the Assyrian culture, the Babylonian culture, Canaanite culture, Egyptian culture. Their worldview had room for things beyond what they could perceive, what they could touch or feel or measure. They had room for the supernatural. That was part of their worldview. Of course, it varied from place to place, and that's why you'd want to dip into the culture or the worldview, the assumptions, religions and philosophy of a given civilization in order to understand what it meant if the reference is in an Egyptian context, or if it's Israel in exile and they're operating in Babylon, what was their worldview? Another area that fits under historical context that you might not automatically assume to think about is climate. We're not talking so much about historic elements in climate like perhaps a flood or an eclipse, solar eclipse. We're just saying, if the passage you're dealing with, here's an idea. Think of the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth opens up with a famine in Israel. This is a climatological catastrophe. Well, it's very important to understand how dependent Israel was by virtue of their style of farming being dry farming, dependent on rivers and precipitation, as opposed to other regions that depend on, say in Egypt, the flooding of the Nile and pulling up water out of the Nile, pumping it, frankly, out into adjacent fields in order to provide irrigation. Similarly, irrigation was a very important feature about agriculture in Babylon. They had extensive canal systems in various regions there. So that meant they were not strictly dependent on precipitation in their region. They were dependent on precipitation upstream, bringing enough water through the river so that then they could pump it out and move it through their carefully devised irrigation canals. This is an insight into climate and, admittedly, agriculture that helps us understand particular passages. You could take that, for example, into Psalm 1, where he talks about a tree planted by rivers of water. This is a tree that's not dependent on occasional up and down precipitation, but it's planted by a river, a perennial moisture supply. Insights of this sort then illuminate the passage. Climate, then, is one to watch for if your passage deals with it. Employment. Employment can range from what was it like to work as a farmer? What was it like to work as a herdsman? What was it like to operate as a merchant? What was it like to operate in the military? What was your work? Was it seasonal? And how did payment derive? This list, customs, government, worldview, geography, I skipped that, didn't I? Geography, climate, and employment, these are not at all comprehensive, but are just intended to give you an idea of what direction to go. Material objects, incidentally, are another way to move in a historical context study. So, for example, if your passage talks about pottery, perhaps it's the account of the widow who was instructed by the prophet to begin pouring oil into one of her jugs, and she poured it into jug after jug after jug, and she had just a long-lasting supply of oil. Well, there, it would be worth looking at the material objects of pottery, and incidentally being familiar with the importance of olive oil in that culture. These are avenues of historical inquiry. Now, where will you learn about this? You will learn about this, these insights will come through the help of reading substantial resources that take the time to fill you in. Secondary sources. Sometimes it will be covered by a commentary. So, for example, you're looking at Numbers, grab a solid, and when we're talking solid, we're talking about a commentary, preferably written no earlier than 50 years ago. It doesn't mean there's no value before 50 years, but if you're limiting yourself to materials 50 years and older, you're missing out on recent discoveries. So work with 50 years or newer. Incidentally, be sure you're working with original publication date on that. Some publications have been reprinted. They might be printing something from the 1800s, and it could have a 1975 date on it. You want to look at the time of origin in order to ensure that you're working with current materials. So commentaries can be a source. Bible dictionaries, and here, please move beyond the one volume like the Haley's Handbook. That's handy for lay people. You're working at the graduate level. Get accustomed to using substantial Bible dictionaries, preferably multi-volume Bible dictionaries, Anchor Bible Dictionary, or even better yet, the InterVarsity series, Dictionary of the Old Testament. These will give a series of articles. It's almost like a journal. Think of these as a journal, a series of articles on different topics and books. So if you're interested in climate, look up an article under C, climate. If you're interested in monarchy, look under M, monarchy. If you're interested in travel, you can look up articles in these dictionaries, not only by the Bible book, they will have multiple page articles, but then by the topic as well. Other places to go would be journals, looking up, putting in your search engine whatever is the passage or the commodity, the element of historical inquiry that you're interested in. By the way, are you aware that when you open up a solid multi-volume dictionary, Bible dictionary, such as this Dictionary of the Old Testament by InterVarsity, at the end of every article, you will find a substantial bibliography that can then become a launching point for you to narrow down your focus, tracking down articles that scholar used to write the article. And of course, there will be information that the scholar was unable to compress into the confines of the dictionary article. You can look at the sources they used and learn even more. Now, as you employ these sources, you will want to give credit for them. And I'm not requiring that for this assignment you produce a separate sheet that is a bibliography in order to make it a little simpler for you. Don't worry about that. I should be able to simply look at your footnotes and use complete full citation footnotes. Then I'll be able to know, in my head, I'll kind of construct your bibliography for you, and I'll be able to tell if you've done sufficient research to learn what can you discover of historical background, taking advantage of scholarly resources of this sort. Incidentally, can I give you a suggestion on formatting of citations, particularly as it relates to information that you derive from a Bible dictionary? It's the default understanding of most people as they approach research and use a Bible dictionary or any dictionary where you have articles that are signed off by individual writers. That's the keynote. Articles that are signed off by an individual scholar, as opposed to a dictionary that's just all written by one person. Incidentally, that's not going to be very, very substantial because we don't have very many geniuses around who can span multiple volumes of biblical information as one person and do a credible job with it. Instead, these dictionaries, the articles are parceled out to various scholars. Individuals in our seminary often are contributing to various dictionaries. So an individual scholar will do the work and then sign it off. Sometimes they just leave the initials. You'll have to look up in the front of the dictionary what the initials stand for and who it was that wrote that article. When then you go to cite an article within a Bible dictionary, it's important to use proper formatting, and that means treating that article, think of it like a journal article. So, for example, if you were citing a journal article out of, let's say, Journal for Biblical Literature, JBL, now you wouldn't cite an article by the editor of the journal. If it's written by a scholar, you would want to list the author of that journal article. And then you give the title of that journal article. And then, oh, by the way, the title of the journal in which it's found, Journal for Biblical Literature, and the issue date and pages and so forth. That's the mentality you want to use when you're citing a Bible dictionary article. Yes, you will give the title of the dictionary as a whole, Dictionary of the Old Testament, Pentateuch by University, and so forth. Yes, you will credit the editor of that dictionary as a whole, but that is secondary information. What goes up front, just like a journal article, will be the scholar who wrote the particular article that you cited. So, for example, maybe you're looking at pottery, and you want to credit the scholar who wrote that article. Then you give the article title. Let's suppose it's Pottery in the Biblical World or something like this. You'll give that title in quotes, just as if it were a journal article title, and then follow with the volume within which it's found. Say Dictionary of the Old Testament, Pentateuch. That'll be italicized. So please pay attention to proper formatting in citing dictionary articles. All right, so let's assume you've gotten to this point. You've collected your insights. Then, instead of just baldly stating those insights, similar to what you did with literary insights, literary devices, I want you to stop and think about the importance of that insight. How valuable is that? How much light does it shed on the passage that you're studying? You may be wondering, well, how can I assess that? How can I measure that? Let's again use a similar vantage point as we used with the literary devices, and that is a negative vantage point. That is to say, take the information that you've derived, say something about pottery, and then ask yourself, if I didn't know that, if I was unaware of the information that I've just discovered, what would be lost in my understanding, my appreciation of the passage that's before me right now, the numbers, in your case, Numbers 22 to 24. Reflect on that a bit, and in a line or two, just jot that down. So that's what we're looking for. As far as the quantity, notice on the far right column, 3 to 5 pages within that spread, you should be able to list five substantial historical insights. Hopefully you will find 10 or 15, and among those, sort them so that the strongest, the most illuminating, the most gripping and interesting insights are the ones that you sort out and select for inclusion in this report. And be sure to indicate the importance of each one, as we've talked about, commenting on it negatively. All right, let's go to an example in column 3. You can see a passage from Proverbs 11:1. A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. Notice that there is a particular tool that's mentioned here, a false balance. Similar to that, accompanying feature is a weight, a just weight. There is a tool, an instrument used in the ancient world. What we want to do is look up what did this involve. If we think of a balance or a scale, simply from a modern viewpoint, we'd probably be thinking about truck scales or perhaps a bathroom weight scale, some device. This is our modern framework. We want to remove those modern lenses and imagine this passage in the ancient world. Here's what we would discover. We would discover that the scales were, as suggested by the word balance, a false balance. The scale consisted of a balance arm. Imagine a horizontal piece of wood or metal pierced in the center, somehow tied off with a string so that it could be suspended, and that arm would need to be able to tip down to the left or down to the right. It would need to balance. Suspended from that then would be, on either ends of those balance arm, would be pans, small little trays that would be suspended. I'm sure you're beginning to picture this in your own mind. You've seen sketches of something like this. We would want to picture that and then realize that the material being purchased would be placed on the pan on one side, and then a weight, a predetermined and authorized measure of weight, would be placed on the left. Obviously, the balance beam that we're envisioning, I'm envisioning one that's perhaps 5 or 6 inches long, with perhaps a 3-inch suspension down to the pans. This is not going to measure large commodities of grain. Rather, the one I have in mind, in my imagination, is one that would commonly be used to measure precious metals, or perhaps incense or some other commodities that are condensed and highly valuable. So imagine some pieces of silver. I'm not thinking of coins at this point. I'm thinking of actually fragments of silver before coins were being stamped. Fragments of silver on one side, and then on the other side some precious commodity, perhaps incense or spices or something of this sort. That's the picture we want to have in mind. The second feature we want to have in mind is how commonly these were used. If you looked for a balance beam of that sort in today's society, you would almost have to go to a museum. They are so unusual. But back in the ancient world, this would have been a common device. If you went to the marketplace, perhaps to the city gates, to do some merchant transaction, either you would bring your own scales as a purchaser, or certainly the merchant there would have his or her scales, and the merchant would also have some weights, or you would bring your own weights. And here comes the crux of the issue for the message of Proverbs 11:1. A false balance, a false weight, would be a way of gouging either the buyer or the seller, whoever's controlling the balance. So it's saying that ethical transactions in business are of a high value to God. Let's reflect on the question of importance. How important was this? Well, the insight that I would suggest is to be aware of how common the usage and possession of such balances would have been for everyday exchanges. It's not as rare as the use of such a commodity would be today, although admittedly, if you go into certain markets even today, if you're purchasing, say, from a meat market, that's sold by weight, and it's right there. But that's mostly our purchases by weight would be limited to that. Everything else is prepackaged. Some of those have weights on them, but as far as a live raw weight, an irregular weight, shall we say, down to the fraction of a pound, it's largely for our commerce limited to the experience of purchasing meat in a market. So in contrast to that, in the ancient world, the use of weights and balances would have been a common, virtually an everyday occurrence. So God is saying in the everyday practice of monetary transactions with your neighbor, with a merchant, God is saying, I want that everyday sort of transaction to be marked by ethical transparency. This is the way I'd like you to conduct your study of the historical background of a passage. Once again, you'll be examining Numbers 22 to 24. Begin by reading the account there and jot down what you think may be historical insights of historical value or topics that are worth exploring. Then make your way to the library and use some substantial resources. Part of the way you'll demonstrate having executed this assignment to a high level is by the stature of the resources that you use. It's tempting to just go to the web, look up some easily accessible pieces that may be of common or moderate scholarly stature. That's not the way to really do your work as a Bible scholar. Take the time while you're in seminary. Make an appointment with yourself to get to the library, or if you're restricted to a web execution of this assignment, please take care to make sure that you are looking up some substantial resources and not making shortcuts or making this an experience of just minimal engagement. As you mine historical insights, you will find it immensely illuminating for a passage for you and also those that you are shepherding, that you are seeking to nurture by your teaching of God's Word to those He entrusts to you to lead.